And joining us now to discuss the issue of aid to Ukraine as well as that development coming from Sweden, we are joined by Mr. Benjamin Tallis, Senior Research Fellow from the German Council on Foreign Relations. Good afternoon and welcome to TVP World.
Good afternoon. Pleasure to be with you.
So now, what is your opinion? What do you make of the special military support budget that Sweden has announced that it plans on creating, a worth of 6.4 billion euro for the years 2024 to 2026?
Well, it's a good step. And I think it's also good that we don't call it aid. This is not aid. This is not charity. This is an investment in European security. And that's something that the Swedish government has very clearly realized. It's very good for Ukraine to know that they will have consistency of financial support over that time. And Sweden is not alone in doing this. It's been joined by some of its Nordic neighbors. Estonia has committed 0.25% of its GDP each year to actually supporting Ukraine. So it's good to have that clarity. But at the same time, we're still not collectively giving enough for Ukraine to win, and that has to be the priority.
Right, so we were discussing Sweden. However, our Ukraine correspondent has pointed out that this amount, 7 billion, is not nearly enough. It's not really that significant when it comes to the needs, right, that Ukraine has. And a lot of it is, it seems to be this political play, right, just sort of political niceties. And I wanted to ask you about Germany, right? So the country, I think, is at the forefront in terms of the amount of aid being provided from Europe, right? I mean, the total amount of support or investment, as you've mentioned, that Germany provides is, I believe, the highest, not in terms of the GDP, but the overall amount. However, the Germans are also quite reluctant to provide certain kinds of weapons. So what is what are the what is the approach here, right? I mean, more money, but not certain kinds of weapons. How can we understand that?
Yes, it's a really good question because I'm normally based in Berlin, and a lot of people there ask why Germany is not getting the credit that some in the Chancellery around Olaf Scholz think that Germany deserves for being that European leader in terms of the absolute financial amount of support given to Ukraine. Well, the answer is really very simple. Germany hasn't actually committed to Ukraine's victory. Olaf Scholz keeps saying that Ukraine must not lose and Russia must not win. But that's actually a world away from saying we support Ukraine to win, because this is something that the Chancellor actually fears to a certain degree. So I think this is really important to emphasize also that if Germany had committed to Ukraine's victory, we would likely see those weapons that you mentioned, like Taurus, being given. But also we would expect to see yet more money because, as you rightly said, Germany is not near the top of the league table when it comes to looking at the amount that's been given relative to its GDP. And of course, Germany is the largest economy in Europe by far. So if we saw it commit to victory, we'd expect them to be doing much more. Overall, I think it's also a little unfair to criticize the Swedes for not providing enough. This is a country with a much smaller overall GDP than Germany. And what we have to look at is the overall package of support that's being given by all European allies whose interest it is very firmly in that Ukraine wins the conflict, and see, is that enough to actually achieve victory? Are we giving the right things at the right time as well as the right amount of money? And of course, what we're not doing at the moment is seizing those Russian assets, the $300 billion worth in frozen assets that would provide us with a ready war chest to make Russia pay for its own defeat.
Right, let me just sort of quickly follow up on that. You said that Olaf Scholz fears commitment to Ukraine's victory. Can you clarify that, if I understood correctly?
Yes, well, I mean, we're more than 2 years into the full-scale war, and the German Chancellor has still not said that Ukraine should win. So we have to conclude this is not an accident. This is the policy. And as far as our analysis shows, the reason for that policy is because they fear what would be called a system-transforming effect of Ukraine's victory. What that means is that we would see a group of democracies, including Ukraine, really standing up to and opposed to the autocracies, the authoritarian regimes, the dictatorships like Russia and China, Iran and North Korea, who really threaten our way of life. Now, adjusting to that system would mean a substantial adjustment for Germany's economic model, because they are still extremely reliant on trade with China, on investment from China, and on raw materials. coming from China and processed materials too. So this would imply a really big change. It's the change we need if we're going to align our prosperity with our security and not have our economics undermine our geopolitics. But it's not a change that Germany's leaders are yet willing to make.
Right.
Now,
Yeah, go ahead. I just wanted to comment that it's very similar to when the sanctions needed to be introduced, right? I mean, this has forced certain countries to switch gears, right, and sort of find other solutions. So I believe that Germany could do that.
Right. What about, I'd like to go back to the frozen Russian assets that you mentioned, because we know the United States, they have come out and said, and they were all for seizing the frozen Russian assets outright and then having them sent to Ukraine. However, there has been more reluctancy, as you said, in Europe. We've heard, for example, of using just the windfall profits of those assets. Why is there such a difference, and why is there hesitancy in Europe when it comes to seizing and using these assets?
It's the right question to ask, because once you're seizing the profits on these things, you are effectively taking someone else's property to make a point and to show that they've stepped out of line. And there's no difference between doing that and actually seizing the asset itself. Also, all of the financial risk of this move was actually already priced in when we froze the assets in the first place. And we did that very quickly in a move that I think shocked some governments around Europe. And it seems as though the main reason driving this, there's several objections that are given. There's legal objections. They say, can we do this legally? And that's been conclusively answered that yes, in fact, you can. There's been financial and economic objections made, saying, would this destabilize our economies? Would it lead to Russian counteraction? Well, Russia got its retaliation in first. It's already been seizing assets from our companies based in Russia. And of course, our central banks don't have assets actually in Russia. So there's a limit to what they can do, and what they could do, they're already doing already. So I don't think we have to worry too much about that. Financial risk, does it destabilize the Eurozone and the euro as a base currency? Well, there's not too many other places for people who want to invest to actually go. If you're looking at the G7 currencies, the dollar, the euro, Canadian dollar, the Japanese yen, and so on, that is by far the majority of the tradable currencies in the world, which can be used as reserve currencies. So I don't think we have to worry about that. So then we get to what is actually the real problem here, which is the lack of political will. And this comes from an inability to actually weigh risks against each other. Let's think about this. What is the risk that we offset, that we take by seizing these assets? Some say, well, it would violate law or it would destabilize the order. That's nothing compared to the risk that we run by not punishing Russia's aggression and the Russian destabilization of the international order that we see. We run a far higher risk if Russia gets away with it than if we make Russia pay.
Right. What about Western companies that still operate in Russia? Wouldn't that be easier? Because then they are paying taxes, right, to the Kremlin. So, of course, also fueling the Russian war machine. Wouldn't that be easier just to sort of, yeah.
Well, yeah, we should stop them doing that as well. And we should really encourage them to get out and make it very clear that we don't approve of sanctions violations. We don't think we should be doing business with those authoritarian regimes. And certainly we should not be doing anything that supports Russia's war machine. So I think we have to be a bit tougher with our companies on that as well. But the companies that operate in Russia, as I say, are already under strict controls from the Kremlin. Some have had their assets seized. Look at what happened to Danone. Look at what happened to Carlsberg. And more will come. So I think we have to make it clear that we will help our companies relocate, but we don't have to fear too much the risk of having their assets seized, because Russia will do that regardless of what we do with Russian central bank assets.
Now, what about, as this war in Ukraine, of course, Russia's illegal invasion drags on, there is a peace summit that Switzerland is organizing in June. And of course, Russia isn't invited, and they, of course, have said that even if they had been, they wouldn't come. What do you think? What might be the outcome of this summit, and and how important is it that we have it now? I mean, does it help keep the issue of Ukraine on the table, as in some countries we have heard of something like war fatigue?
I think the main bonus of this summit, or the main benefit it brings, is that it shows that actually it is Ukrainians who are wanting peace to happen, but they won't want it to happen on any terms. And to invert that old saying, I think, honestly, it's not a case of the war dragging on. We need to give the war a chance. We need to give war a chance here, because it's a war that needs to be won. And the Ukrainians are fighting for their lives, for the survival of their country, and frankly, providing a shield for us in Europe in particular against Russian aggression. So regardless of this fatigue that is talked about, I don't understand how Western Europeans or whoever it is who's tired of this war can be tired if we look at the sacrifices Ukraine is making for all of our benefit. We have to actually understand that we're in a fight and we need to win it here. So while the peace conference is good for keeping this in the agenda, there will be no peace until Russia is put in a position that it has to negotiate peace. And we have to make sure that Ukraine can do that from a position of strength. And ideally, that would be a position whereby all Russian troops are out of all of Ukraine, and that we can thus bring Ukraine clearly into our institutions in Europe, the European Union, but first NATO, in order to actually have a stable security situation in Europe. That's how we in the free world win this conflict, and it's not about us getting tired. We have to win this, otherwise the outcome will be worse for all of us.
Absolutely. So speaking about the summit in Switzerland, there is a country that has been invited, and I mean China. However, it is also a highly controversial country. On one hand, trying to position itself as a peacemaker, right? Even suggesting a peace plan at some point for the Russia-Ukraine war. However, on the other hand, Grant Shapps yesterday announced that the UK intelligence has proof that China is providing lethal weapons to Russia. So what do we do with that sort of, conflicting statements and evidence, and sort of what should be EU's policy towards China?
Well, we've seen a confused policy for years that talks about a partner, a competitor, and a rival. And I think it's hopefully become more clear to more people in Europe and in the United States in the last few years that China is not our friend. It's not really so much of a good partner. There are some things we'll have to work with China on, and it's seen that China has played a useful role in ensuring that Russia knows it's unacceptable to use nuclear weapons in this conflict, although honestly, I think our own nuclear deterrence and our nuclear capabilities plays a much bigger role in that, and also our conventional capabilities. That's what deterrence is, and that's why we credibly deter Russia. But more broadly, we are in a competition against authoritarian regimes. And yes, that includes Russia, but it also includes China. We've seen a trade model and an economic model in the last 30 years or so, which under the banner of free trade actually allowed Chinese mercantilism and Chinese influence to grow at the expense of people in our own countries. And I think we have to start pushing back against that and take a much more clear-eyed view of what China is. China's an authoritarian regime that does not wish us well. It wishes to have our money, but in order to get that, we have to set much more clear rules of the road for dealing with China and for our businesses to deal with China. They need geopolitical guidance because what we can't afford is that our private companies, in pursuit of profit, which is what businesses do, end up socializing a huge risk to our societies that through dependency or through critical materials that we need and can't get elsewhere. And we have to have that clear view of China. And China can be deterred militarily, but we also have to have a clear economic statecraft component to that as well. So we need to deal with China, but we have to change the terms upon which we deal with China.
Benjamin Tallis, thank you, sir, for being here. Great having you on, and really important insights and points were just made. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.